This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and this is episode 710 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by FanDuel. Thanks for tuning in. The Week 11 NFL Sunday Million is officially live on FanDuel. Showcase your NFL knowledge and construct your best 9-player roster while staying under the salary cap. Then follow along using FanDuel's live scoring feature to compete for your share of $1.3 million in cash prizes, including a cool $250,000 first place prize, all for just $5. Sunday's quickly approaching, so head to FanDuel and submit your lineups today. Eligibility restrictions apply. Go to FanDuel.com or download the FanDuel app for more details. Now let's get to these 10 trends. A lot changed for the Colts this week. They had a new head coach, of course, and then they had a new quarterback too. Matt Ryan was back under center. But Jonathan Taylor also played his first game without Nyheim Hines. And in that game, he had a snap share of 94%. That was a season high. He ran a route on 25 of 29 Indianapolis dropbacks. And he played as the primary pass-catching back in that offense. Taylor moved up my rankings this past week because his usage is looking a lot better with these changes. And we should feel a little bit more optimistic about the Colts offense in general with Matt Ryan under center. The schedule's not perfect, and the Colts aren't going to play the Raiders every week. But it's at least a big plus for Jonathan Taylor. The Cardinals surprisingly released Eno Benjamin on Monday. And it came after Arizona gave James Conner a 96% snap share. That was by far his highest snap share of the season. And it resulted in a running back rush share of 95.5% and a target share of about 9%. He was a complete bell cow. The Cardinals have the toughest running back schedule by adjusted fantasy points allowed from here on out, but with that kind of usage, Conner should still be a starter in fantasy football. They also get the Falcons in Week 17 for what it's worth. We saw the Steelers without Chase Claypool for the first time this past week, and predictably, it was a good thing for Pat Freiermuth. Freiermuth saw an increase in slot snaps by about 10 percentage points, and he ran nearly just as many routes as George Pickens and Deontay Johnson. That resulted in a 26.9% target share, one of his highest marks of the season, and that was in a rough tight end matchup. So the arrow is absolutely pointing up for Pat Freiermuth. Jeff Wilson's role is very, very legit in this Miami offense. It was weird that the market wasn't reacting much to his first game with Miami a couple of weeks ago. And then in his second game, his backfield share just got even better. He played 21 more snaps than Raheem Mostert on Sunday. He saw his running back rush share jump by over 10 percentage points week over week. And his target share this past week was 15%, up from 10% the previous week. Wilson is seeing amazing usage, and Miami continues to have a strong schedule moving forward, especially in the short term. I had Wilson above consensus once again this week in my rest of season rankings at RB17. And by the way, you can get those rankings and tiers by becoming a patron of the Late Round Fantasy Football Patreon. I didn't talk about Isaiah Pacheco in the 15 transactions episode yesterday because you guys know where I stand with that backfield by now. It's the same reason I didn't talk about Donovan Peoples-Jones. These guys have been highlighted in the past. I want to give you guys new transactions. But Isaiah Pacheco saw a career-high 56.5% snap share against Jacksonville on Sunday. Clyde Edwards-Helaire, meanwhile, played 4 total snaps. I talked about this on last week's Sleeper Show, but since the Chiefs started moving away from Edwards-Helaire, they hadn't faced a good matchup for their run game. But they did on Sunday. They did in Week 10. And with a positive game script, Pacheco carried the ball 16 times for 82 yards. He had 89% of Kansas City's running back rushes. So I'll continue to say it. Add Isaiah Pacheco. And Jerick McKinnon can be rostered too. He's getting good usage in the passing game. Let's go from one rookie running back to another and shift to Kenneth Walker. In Week 10, Walker had a career-high 24.2% target share. That nearly doubled his previous high. He didn't have a great game on the ground, but his usage in a negative game script for Seattle bodes very, very well for his rest of season potential. Even though his 17 rushing yards were by far a season low since becoming starter, he still did see every single rush attempt for the Seahawks. So his peripherals were off the charts in that game against Tampa Bay. Trend 7 this week is about Jalen Hurts and his rushing, or lack of rushing. He's been fine in fantasy because he's getting it done with his arm for the most part. And he's still getting some rushing production. But he's definitely running less. And that doesn't give him as high of a ceiling. From weeks 1 through 5, Hurts averaged almost 14 rush attempts per game. Over his last 4 games, that number's fallen to 6.5. During that first 5-week stretch, Hurts was averaging 12.5 standard fantasy points per game with rushing alone. Over his last 4, that number's just 3.7. So is this a big concern? I mean, kind of, but not totally. Hurts is throwing the ball well. And there's one game in week 8 that's bringing some of these rushing numbers down a bit when he ran the ball just twice in a blowout against Pittsburgh. Remember, in that game, he threw the ball exceptionally well. But I do think it's unlikely we see the same ceiling that we saw during the first 5 weeks of the season, at least consistently. Of course, he can still put together some monster games. He's actually still someone that I'm higher on versus the market. It was just always going to be hard to maintain what he was doing from weeks 1 through 5. We have evidence that Atlanta will be slightly more pass heavy if they're trailing. This is good news. In week 10, the Panthers beat the Falcons pretty convincingly. And in that game, Atlanta's pass rate, which I'm defining as pass attempts divided by total pass and rush attempts, was 58%. So 58% of their pass and rush attempts were passes. That's the highest that it's been all season. It's only the second time it's been over 50%, meaning it was only the second time this season Atlanta's thrown the ball more than they've run it. And imagine that, Drake London finishes a wide receiver 2 in fantasy for the first time since week 2. Funny how that works. It's hard to be optimistic that this is going to be the way they run their offense moving forward. They've got winnable games on their schedule until basically Christmas Eve, but it's at least something. Rondale Moore has 3 straight top 20 performances at the position in PPR formats, and he's hit a 30% target share in each of his last 2. He may not have a crazy high ceiling in fantasy just given how they deploy him, but he's seeing enough volume each week to the point where a ceiling can sort of be formed. There's nothing wrong with 8 or 9 catches for 90 yards in a PPR league. And things could get even better from a volume perspective with Zach Ertz out. The last trend this week has to do with the Cleveland Browns. I brought this up before, but it hasn't changed, and to me, it's kind of wild. So the Browns have 24 offensive touchdowns this year. Only 8 of those have been passing touchdowns. So they have a passing touchdown rate of 33%. 33% of their touchdowns have come via passing. That's by far, and I mean by far, the lowest in the league. Based on their pass rate, that touchdown rate should be like 24 or 25 percentage points higher. Now, if you want to factor in personnel and such and say, but they have Nick Chubb and they have Jacoby Brissett, I understand that. You could probably lower that number a little bit. But even still, they're huge regression candidates in terms of how they're scoring their touchdowns. This explains why Donovan Peoples-Jones has the most receiving yards in football without a touchdown this year. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Remember to check out LateRound.com. Specifically, you should check out the Patreon. You can get access to my rest of season rankings and tiers, my weekly rankings and tiers, dynasty rankings, an awesome Discord community, live Q&As, and more. Check it out, LateRound.com. Thanks for listening, everyone. I'll talk to you tomorrow.